I didn't talk about kernels yet, right? It's a lecture about kernel methods, but I didn't talk about kernels. So in a sense, what I did was like the easy and boring stuff of how to learn linear models. Okay, so there is nothing new in what I said. I just said that if you decide to work with vectors x and to learn a linear function, then there are like principled methods, statistical methods that exist to estimate function either for regression or classification that work even if you're in high dimension with limited number of points. And these are, so this is a subclass of all the methods that exist, of course, but this is a class of functions that minimize. So you solve an optimization problem where you look for a linear function that minimizes a trade-off, a linear combination of a risk, which is typically an average loss over your training points, penalized by lambda times the Euclidean norm of the vector of weights. Okay, and this simple formula, in fact, encompasses many state-of-the-art methods like support vector machines, logistic regression, ridge regression, etc. So what we will do in this second part of the lectures is to drastically extend the applicability of these methods and to show that there are like tricks and tools that we can use in order to do exactly this, but in much more abstract and general linear spaces. And this will be the topic of kernels and kernel methods now. Okay. So to motivate kernel methods, up to now I said let's just look at linear models. So we have data which are vectors, and we build a linear model. This could be good in some cases, and this could be not interesting in other cases. Like if you want to solve this classification problem, you see black and white points again, and you want to learn a rule to discriminate black from white, and then you will be able to, given a new point, to predict what's the color. Is it black or white? You see here that it doesn't seem to be a good idea to work with linear models, because whatever algorithm you use, if you run a line in this space, you will just have wrong models. So I said at the beginning that sometimes it's good to learn slightly wrong models if they are simplified, but here you obviously see that intuitively the black points are in the center and the yellow are in the periphery, so you don't want to learn a line to separate black from white. Intuitively you see there are simple models like just a circle that would separate the black from the white and which are not linear in this space. So they are not linear in this space, but there is a simple idea which again is not new at all, which is that perhaps you can transform your data. And instead of seeing each point as, each point in 2D here is defined by two coordinates, so I call them x1 and x2. Perhaps you can change the representation of your points and map them to some new space where the simple circle here that you would like to learn becomes a linear model. And in this case, it's quite easy because, for example, if you start from points x1 and x2 and you map them to a new space where the coordinates is also a two-dimensional space, but the new coordinates are just x1 square and x2 square, then you see that, let's say, if you take this circle here, so the equation of a circle in the space on the left is something like x1 square plus x2 square equals r square. So the discrimination function that would learn a circle is a function of the form x1 square plus x2 square minus r square equals 0. Then this thing is quadratic on the left, but on the right, where we have changed the coordinates, it becomes a linear function because it's just 1 times x1 square plus 1 times x2 square. So it's just the linear model 1 times x1 square x2 square minus a constant. Okay, so it's just to say that this circle here, when you map it on the right, becomes a line. Okay, and therefore it's what we call a linear model. So the key idea of kernel methods is really summarized here. What we will do with kernel methods is that we will still only learn linear models, but instead of learning or estimating the models from the data when you give me the data, we may change the data to map them to some new space here on the right, so that on the new space, linear models are good enough to solve your problems. So good enough could be in this case that they are like the natural classifier, the natural models to discriminate your data. In some other cases, it could be that you have some prior knowledge And you know that after some transform, it's better to, a linear model could be good in some representation of your data. Okay, so this is what we will do. And in a sense, you know, I spent already 1 hour and a half to explain how to learn linear models. What I said before, we will apply it exactly here on the right-hand side of the space. Okay, so all that I said, we will use it here. So here we can learn a linear support vector machine, or we can do ridge regression, we can do logistic model, but we will do it on the right-hand space here instead of on the original data. Okay, so up to now it doesn't seem to be very complicated or very tricky. I just say we change the data and then we learn a linear model. Now there will be a trick here, which is that the family of kernel methods are methods like all the ones I showed before will end up to be these methods that you can implement in this space by simple computations. Okay, meaning that we will be able to work in this space here at the end without explicitly mapping the points. So this I need to explain, and this will be the topic of this part of the lecture on kernel methods. Okay, so let me now talk about kernels a bit. So I've used the word kernel for a while. So in my picture, what is a kernel? A kernel is simply a function k of two variables, which corresponds to some inner product. So transpose here just means you do some inner product between the points you consider after mapping them to some space. Okay, so it's, in a sense, to be a bit more formal, you assume that you have data living in a space X. There could be vectors. Up to now, I just considered vectors, but later we will consider more general data like time series or images or text, whatever. So X and X prime would be 2 points in some space of data. And what we will do at the end is that, as I said, we will map our data to some new space. So I will call phi the mapping from your original data to some space which is a linear space. And then we will learn a linear model in this space here. Okay? So if you do that, given a mapping phi from your input space X to some representation space, so here, sorry, it's written F, but I will use the letter H instead. So I call H, capital H, the space on the right. When you do this mapping, we define a kernel. The definition of kernel is simply a function of two variables X and X prime that live in your data. So you could take like two images, and you define the kernel between two images, X and X prime, as the inner product after you map them to your Hilbert space, or the vector space for the moment, where we will do the linear model. Okay, so it's just, there is nothing complicated here. It's just we give a name to something which is inner product after mapping the point to some space. For example, just in the slide before, I said, well, in order to learn a circle to discriminate the black from the white, perhaps we can map the space, the 2D space to some new 2D space, where we replace a point x1, x2 by the point x1 square, x2 square. When we do that, this defines a kernel. So in this case, with my words, this defines a kernel between two vectors that live in 2D here. And if I call x and x prime two points, with coordinates x1, x2, and x1 prime, x2 prime, then the kernel between the two vectors is the inner product after I map them to the space on the right. So this would be the equation of my kernel. It's a bit ugly, but I just write down explicitly to show you there is nothing hidden here. If you give me x and x prime two vectors living in 2 dimensions, the kernel between the two vectors in this case would be the inner product after the mapping to the 2D space here, which is by definition x1 square, x1 prime square. This is the product of the first coordinates, plus x2 square, x2 prime square. Okay, so it's one kernel. Here it seems that we did something that's not very interesting. You know, I just give a name to something that seems a bit complicated, but it's just the notion of kernel, which is inner product associated to some mapping phi. So each time you define a mapping phi from your data to some vector space, then you have a kernel associated, which is inner product at the end. The important thing, again, is that here you see that the equation of a kernel is in terms of input data. So here, x and x prime are my input data, and the kernel is really a function of two input data points. Okay? it goes through definition of phi, but it's a formula that you can compute given two input data. So why did we give a name to this object, which seems to be just one part? I mean, it's just something inner product after mapping. Why did we give a name, and why do I give a lecture on kernel methods as if kernels were important? The reason for that is that, in fact, so one way to justify it is that there are two tricks. So trick is not well defined in mathematics, but we will see later what it means. There are two tricks with kernels that give them some very good properties and lead to very efficient algorithms for machine learning. So I decide to call that two tricks. I think it's not very common to most of the time we talk of the kernel trick, but I will talk of the kernel tricks because there are two important ideas to get from the kernels, which I will develop. So the first idea, and the reason why we talk about kernels, is that I said that what we will do at the end is that we will start from input data. They could be two-dimensional, or they could be any data. There could be text or images. We will map them to some vector space here. And on the right, we will learn something with L2 regularized method, like we will do support vector machine, for example. Then the first trick that we will see is that even though when I say that, it seems that I need, I start from endpoints, so I could potentially compute the images of the endpoints, and then I could use the algorithms I have presented in the beginning of my lectures to solve it. What we will see is that in many cases, this is not necessary. And in many cases, you can run or you can estimate your model on the space on the right without computing the images of the points. So computing the images means for given x to compute phi of x. We will see that in particular, all the methods I discussed can be implemented in this space without writing phi anywhere. Because instead of writing phi in the algorithm, we will be able to express the algorithm in terms of kernel k. Okay, so there is a link between phi and k. K is the inner product of phi of x and phi of x prime. But we will see that to run the method here, even though it seems that we need to compute the points, in fact, we don't need to compute the points. We will just need to compute the kernels. That's one thing. Now, the second and related trick, which makes the thing interesting, is that there are many cases, and this will be the topic of the next section of my lectures. There are many cases where it's much easier or much more efficient to compute the kernel k than to compute the image phi of x. Okay, so this is a bit surprising at first sight because when I define a kernel, remember I say that if you give me a phi, then you can define a kernel, and the kernel between x and x prime is simply you compute phi of x, you compute phi of x prime, and you make the inner product. This is the kernel. So it seems that we need to compute phi of x prime, and then do the inner product in order to compute the kernel. But in fact, and we will see many examples of that, there are many cases where you can compute directly the kernel without computing phi of x or phi of x prime. Okay, and in particular, there are many cases where phi of x could be a very long vector. Sometimes it would be some infinite dimensional vector. So we will never be able, in your computer to compute phi of x. You would need some infinite amount of memory and of time. So it seems to be crazy to work in this infinite dimensional space. But there will be many cases where even though phi could be infinite dimensional, then it would be very, very easy to compute a kernel k between these infinite dimensional representations. Okay? We will see examples of that. But from now, if you combine these two tricks, you see that potentially you will be able to work in some complicated spaces here. Suppose you define some mapping phi, which could be very complicated, infinite dimensional, etc. The first trick will tell you that in this space, even though computing phi of x could be difficult, it could be easy instead to compute the kernel between so the kernel between x and x prime. And if you combine this with the first trick, then the first trick tells you that to run these linear models here, you don't need to compute phi, you just need to compute k. So when you combine the two tricks, you will be able to solve and to compute all these linear models in some complicated space, but in practice using just the kernel. Okay, so these are the two tricks that make the kernel methods so popular and so useful to model complicated objects. So we will see quite a few examples, and I'll try to illustrate these two things. So let's directly let me convince you that at least the trick one is true on the case of support vector machines. SVM, remember I presented it in the first part of the lectures. I said SVM, this is the algorithm that finds this line which is far away from the points. And I said you can directly write it as learning a linear model that minimizes the average hinge loss plus lambda times the squared error. Okay? And I also said that if you have taken a basic course on optimization, then you know that this quadratic problem has a dual problem, which you can write, and I write it here. So here I write it completely. This is the dual problem that is solved by SVM. And so I said that, well, at the end, you have the choice between, when you implement it, you could solve the primal problem, which lives in dimension p, the dimension of the space, or you could solve the dual problem, which lives in dimension n, where n is the number of points. You have the choice, and when you get the solution to any of them, you get the solution to the other one. Okay? Now let's look at, for example, at the dual problem. So the dual problem, I write it here completely. It was a maximization in alpha, which is n-dimensional vectors. Remember the alpha where in the picture I showed the points, and I mentioned the support vectors, which were the points where alpha was strictly positive, and for many of them alpha was 0. So this is the variable over which you optimize. So to find alpha, you need to maximize some quadratic concave function, and there were some constraints. And we know, so here I did not explicitly write it earlier, but it's easy to find. You know that once you find the alpha, so your algorithm, you would find the alpha, and once you have the alpha, when you want to predict the function at a new point x, so in order to predict the color or the class of a new point, then you need to make a linear combination. So this is your linear model in x, and in fact, so up to now I call beta the vector of weights that defines the linear model. But the link between the primal and the dual model was that beta was equal to the sum of alpha I, yi, xi. So when you plug this beta in the function, you get a prediction f that can be expressed in terms of alpha. So in short, if you want to run a SVM, you need to solve this problem in alpha, and then once you have alpha, you can predict the color of new points. Now suppose you do that. So here, you see that, of course, you have the training data, x and y. And when you look in detail where the x and the y play a role here, let's look at the x. They are here. Here you have xj transpose xi. And here you have xi transpose x. Okay? Elsewhere, there is no x anymore. So this is where the data are used to train this algorithm. Okay, now suppose you want to run this SVM not directly over the x's, but after mapping the x to some points phi of x. Then what changes is simply that you need to replace x by phi of x. So you need to solve this problem. So it's again a problem in alpha. And the only thing that has changed is that instead of xi transpose xj, now you want to run that on the other space. So it's phi of xi times phi of xj. Okay? And the second thing that changes is that when you will predict the color of a new point, you need to make the sum of alpha yi times phi of xi transpose phi of x. Okay, so here I did nothing. I just said, well, we can run SVM in the input space, or we can run SVM after mapping by a function phi. Okay. But here you see clearly this trick one that can be applied here, because you notice that to train the algorithm or to make prediction, you need the phi of x only through some inner products. So remember that given a phi I called kernel, the kernel between 2 points was the inner product between their images under phi. So here this is exactly the kernel between xi and xj on the top. And for the prediction, this is the kernel between xi and x. So I can replace these inner products by simply the value in terms of kernel, k of xi xj, k of xi x, and I get an expression of my algorithm, which is learning this linear support vector machine on the space after mapping by phi, which is expressed only in terms of kernel. Okay? Here the phi have disappeared. The phi are hidden in the kernel, but I don't need to compute phi of x formally. Okay? There is no phi anymore. If you give me a recipe to compute a kernel k, then I can plug the value of the kernel here and here. and I will be able to learn my function, which is the linear SVM on the space after mapping by phi. Okay, so that's what I call the first trick, which is some algorithms can be formulated just in terms of the kernel, even though we work in the space defined by phi. We have removed the impact of phi, and phi is only hidden in the kernel now. We will see later that this is not only true for SVM. This will be true for all L2 regularized methods. But at least for SVM, this is quite explicit. It's in the dual formulation. You can just replace the inner product by the kernel. So let's look, for example, let's go back to our example of learning a circle. So I said here, we want to discriminate black from white. So we want, instead of learning a line, perhaps we would love to learn a circle here. And the circle is a line after modifying the data from x1, x2 to x1 square, x2 square. So let's compute the kernel, and let's do something a bit more general than x1 square, x2 square, because it will make our life easier. Let's, for example, for a given point in 2D here, x1, x2, we map it to a three-dimensional vector space. So we create three coordinates, which are x1 square, x2 square, and we also add a cross-product term, x1, x2, with some weight, square root of 2, that will be convenient. Okay, so if we replace x1, x2 by these three vectors, it's clear that in this vector space, linear models in the space of phi correspond to quadratic functions in the input space. So formally, when you map from x1, x2 to this three-dimensional space, the set of linear models are exactly the set of quadratic functions over x1 and x2. Okay, so in particular, it includes the circle, but it could include any parabolic shape or hyperbola, etc. So you may want to work in this space. Now, what's the kernel in this space? So if you do this mapping, there is a kernel associated, which is given two input points. The kernel between the input points is the inner product after you map them as three-dimensional vectors. So let's compute it. When you start from x prime, then when you map them and you take the inner product, you have a sum of three terms, which are the sum of cross products. So you first have x1 square, x1 prime square. Then you have the product of the middle terms. So you have the square root of 2, which I put so that when you take the product, it makes a 2. So you have 2 times x1, x2, x1 prime, x2 prime. This is the product of the middle terms. And then the last term is just the product of the third coordinate, so x2 square times x2 prime square. And here you recognize something quite easy, which is that this thing is simply the square of x1, x1 prime plus x2, x2 prime, which itself is just the standard inner product, but in the input space. So this is exactly x times x prime. Okay, so here there is this funny notion that in order to compute the inner product on the right, there are two options. One would be first to compute the images of x and x prime. So you would compute these two vectors and then make the inner product. This is what we did here. Or, using this factorization, you could just start from your points, two-dimensional points. You compute their inner product in the input space. So there are two vectors. So you can start on the left. You take this point here, the yellow and the black point. You make their inner product, you get a number, then you take the square of this number, and the square of this number is exactly the inner product on the right. This is the formula here. The square of the inner product is the inner product on the right. So that's a case where here there is not a big gain, but potentially it could be interesting, instead of first computing phi of x and then doing the inner product, to directly compute the kernel defined as the square of the inner product in the input space. Now, to make the thing a bit more interesting, in fact, as an exercise, you can check that if you start from the input space on the left, which is two-dimensional, you compute the inner product in 2 dimensions. So again, it's a number. And then instead of just taking the square, for instance, you add 1 to this number and you take it to some power, let's say power 5, for example. Then it's an easy operation. Okay, take the inner product, it's equal to, let's say, 2. You do 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 to the power 5 is a number. Okay? Well, you can show that this number, with the same kind of proof, corresponds to some inner product after representing x and x prime by some mapping phi of x and phi of x prime, which in this case would be much more complicated and long to write than just this three-dimensional thing, because if you expand, it's a sum to some power d here, it could be 5 or 10 or whatever, then if you expand it, you will get a long sum of many terms that will contain all monomials of degree up to d. Okay, so in the previous case, I just had this, the square, the cross product. Okay, now if you expand it to some higher power, and if you add a constant, you can imagine that this will be some inner product between a long series of terms whose dimension, so the dimension of the feature space of the phi of x could become quite large. It's just 3 dimensions, but you can count that if you take the inner product to the power 10, then it will be more than 10-dimensional. Question?
Can you define the dimension of the projection space if you just define the inner product in that space? So
no, you can't. No, you can't. No. I mean, so you mean if you give me a kernel, can I tell you in which dimension you live? Well, yes, you can. I mean, 2 comments. First, if you give me a kernel, there is most of the time not a unique way to write it as inner product. So there could be different mappings phi that lead to the same kernel. But where you're correct is that you can define a minimal dimension that would correspond to the minimal dimension needed to express your kernel as some inner product. Like here you need 3 dimensions. And the link is that if you compute the kernel between many points, it's related to the rank of the matrix you will get. The rank of some inner product matrix is the dimension where you live. So potentially it's possible to compute the rank of the maximal rank of a matrix obtained by the kernel. We'll see that later. Yeah.
The kernel is a definition, right? So why don't we from the beginning define it like some function of the feature space, not just the inner product?
So I made a choice to present it this way. We could directly define a kernel, but what's important in a kernel is that it has to be the inner product. And so, for example, if you give me a function k of x prime, whatever it is, like a distance or whatever, then in most cases, this function k will never be an inner product. Okay, so here we focus on a restricted set of functions, which we call kernel, which can be expressed as inner product.
What is the importance of it?
Well, the important
to be able to express it in terms of inner product.
So the importance for me will be that if I can express this as some inner product, then I know that it corresponds to some representation of my points in a space in which I can run my methods, my statistical methods. Okay, so this, I took the road where I say I have phi, so I can work in this space and I can express this in terms of kernel. But all my derivation require that I replace phi of x times phi of x prime by k of x prime. Now, if you start with k, which is not an inner product, formally you could, like for SVM, you could run this algorithm with a k, with any k, but it will correspond to something that does nothing you can understand, and probably that will not learn a good function. Okay, so this is a case. This thing has a name. It's called the polynomial kernel, and this is an example that goes a bit towards the second trick where I said sometimes it's easier to compute k than to compute phi of x, because in this case, you start from 2-dimensional vectors in terms of number of operations or need for memory, etc. It's easier to compute inner product in 2 dimensions, add a number and multiply it 10 times by itself, than to explicitly represent phi of x, which in this case would be, I didn't count, but in dimension growing exponentially with d. Okay, you can have like high dimensional space corresponding to simple equation. So when you combine the 2 tricks, I said there are these 2 tricks. One is you can express algorithm in terms of kernel, and the second is you can compute the kernel efficiently. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's more efficient to compute the kernel than to compute phi. Then, for example, let's see what is a SVM support vector machine with a polynomial kernel. It simply amounts to, I rewrite exactly the same SVM algorithm, okay? But in place of the kernel k of xi xj, I plug my my expression for the polynomial kernel. So here it becomes xi times xj plus 1 to the power d. I plug it here. And this thing is now an algorithm that will learn a function which is linear in the space implicitly defined by the polynomial kernel, so which is the space, in particular, of when I map all my vectors to the products of up to d of their coordinates. So this is a way to learn, the final function will be a polynomial of degree d in x. Okay, so it's a way to learn a polynomial, a nonlinear polynomial, but using some linear method. And the trick is just a nonlinear polynomial is linear after changing the coordinates. Something interesting here is that in terms of algorithm, I said earlier that to run a linear SVM, you should use libSVM or these kind of things, which are algorithms to solve quadratic programs. Here, it's exactly the same algorithm. Okay, in terms, remember, this is an optimization problem in alpha. We didn't change anything in alpha. What we changed here are just some numbers. So, sometimes you had some inner product which was 2, for example. Now it becomes 35. It's just changing the value of the parameter in the optimization problem. But the problem itself, the structure of the problem doesn't change. So you can use exactly the same algorithm to solve a linear SVM or to solve, let's call that a quadratic or polynomial SVM. The algorithm doesn't change. The implementation is the same. The only thing that you have changed is a few numbers here. Instead of writing the inner product, you take it to the power 2, 3, and you solve it. And you have learned, with the same principle, a nonlinear function which is nonlinear in the input space. Okay, so in practice, it's quite easy to use. Of course, you don't have to re-implement it, but if you want to use it, let me demonstrate that you can do it in just one line in R, for example. There are many implementations nowadays. You can run it in MATLAB, R, C, whatever. So let's take these sorry, the colors are not very strong here, but suppose you want to solve this problem. So it's not the two circles. No, it's a different kind of problem where you have two classes, the red triangle, so upper left and lower right, and the black circles, which are opposite. So this is a case where a line does not seem to be a good classifier because whatever line you choose, you will always have black and red in both places. Here you will have something that separates two positions from two others. So that's a case in particular where it's not a circle, but you see some hyperbole could make a separation. So with a quadratic function, potentially you would be able to separate this. So if you run a linear SVM and using, so here I use a package, it's not the only one, but you go to, in R, you install the package kernlab. Then in one line you can solve the SVM. So the SVM, so here the function ksvm calls the method that optimizes the alpha. Okay, we have to solve alpha. So I said you can implement it yourself or you can use what people have implemented. So ksvm finds the alpha by solving the optimization problem. What you need to give it are the data x. Okay, so you have a matrix of two-dimensional points. The response value y is binary, vector of -1 plus 1. Type, I didn't say much about it, but I just presented one version of SVM. It's called CSVM, so SVC means for classification. There are extensions for regression, etc. So here it's just the basic one. And the kernel here tells you what kernel you want to use. So here, if I want to learn a linear function, the kernel is simply the inner product standard, and it has a name here, which is called vanilla dot, whatever. This is the simplest kernel. So this learns a linear function. And here is the function it has learned. So imagine that there is the important thing is the color represents the level of this function. So it's a linear function that goes from -1 to +2 on this picture. This is +2 here, -1 here, and 0 here. So in terms of classifier, the best it could find if we impose the classifier to be linear is a line that goes through here, which is not very good because one cluster here is on the good side, but the other cluster is on the wrong side. I mean, they are in two different sides. So if we impose SVM to be linear, it does the best it can, but it's not very good. Now, if you want to extend it to nonlinear function, then what you have to do is just to change the kernel here, okay, and say instead of taking the inner product, for example, take the squared inner product. This will learn a quadratic function. So as you can guess, the code will be almost the same. You call the same function KSVM, is the same function because it's the same algorithm, same data x and y, same type of SVM, you don't care. And the only thing you change is the kernel, so the name of the kernel. And for example, taking the inner product to some power is called the polynomial kernel. So here you tell it, take the polynomial kernel, its name is polydot, and define the degree, so to which power do you raise it. So here I think a quadratic function should be enough. So we say take it to the power 2. It will allow you to learn a linear function after mapping the data to their quadratic products. And solve it. So it's very fast to solve, and it gives you a function which finally, it's blue here and here, and it's red here and here. You have some support vectors here that if you have good eyes, you can check them. So this is really, this shows that moving from linear function to at least quadratic function is nothing. It's just raising a few coefficients to the square, running the same algorithm, and simply now you are able to learn nonlinear functions, at least quadratic ones. Okay, so it's not difficult to use. And again, this is one example with Kernlab, but there are many implementations of this kind of models in all languages. Okay, so now let's go a bit further. And here I talked exclusively of support vector machines for kernels, but in fact there is a strong result, which is called the representative theorem, that tells you in particular, so it's a bit more general than that, but for me I will just focus on that, that tells you that all the methods that I described in the first hour, so all what I call the L2 regularized methods, so all the methods that learn a linear function by solving, minimizing some empirical risk plus lambda times the L2 norm of beta. This includes SVM, but this includes ridge regression, logistic regression, etc. All these methods, you can apply the same trick. So for me, it was the trick 1, meaning you can solve them in the space defined by some phi of x without computing phi of x. Okay, and so to formalize it, there is this theorem that tells you that suppose you want to solve your problem here with any loss function. So if you choose a loss function for regression or classification, you need to solve that. Here you need to, so you want to work in the space defined by phi of x. So you say, I want to learn a linear function in the space of phi. So my function becomes f of x is some beta times phi of x. It lives in the space, it's linear in the space of phi. And suppose you want to learn that, then it's always the case that you can express the solution. So the function f of x that you have learned, you can always express it in terms of the kernel. So what is known is that the solution is linear. You can always express it as some beta times phi of x. But here the theorem tells you that, in fact, the beta times phi of x can also be written as some linear combination of kernels. So it's a sum of alpha I kernel between xi and x. So this is the shape of your function you will learn. And you see that the expression depends on some weights alpha. And the weights alpha themselves, you can find them systematically by solving an optimization problem, which is a bit ugly here. But it's ugly, but what you have to look at in this formulation is that this is a formulation where the kernel plays a role. So the data are present through some kernels, and there is no phi here. So this is the kernel tree that tells you that in order to learn the linear model in the space of phi by solving this problem in the space of phi, you could either compute phi of x for all the points and use what we have seen before, or you could use this theorem that tells you that you just need to solve an optimization problem in a vector of alpha. And alpha is again n-dimensional vectors. It does not depend on the dimension of phi of x. It's just a weight of vectors. You will have one weight per each training point. And you have an optimization problem where you need to minimize in alpha something where the kernel plays a role. You solve that, you get a vector of alpha. And once you have your vector of alpha, your function, so your linear function, is expressed in terms of alpha. It's the sum of alpha I k of xi x. Okay, so it's the generalization of what we saw for SVM. For SVM, it seemed to be a bit lucky. I said if you write the dual, then you see there is only the inner product, so you can replace the inner product by the kernel, and it's okay. Now, this thing is more general. It tells you that without computing the dual, whatever, as soon as you L2 regularize some empirical risk, then you can apply the trick. You can work in a feature space without computing phi of x, just computing the kernel. And therefore, for example, if you want to learn a quadratic function, then you can use the quadratic kernel and do ridge regression with quadratic function or with cubic functions, or you can do logistic regression with quadratic functions, the same as SVM. Okay? So, so this theorem is let's see if, yeah, perhaps I will prove it, but let me prove it. Perhaps I will write the proof on the board because otherwise we need to read that, which is not very nice. So the proof actually is quite simple, and I write it because it may be, you know, it gives you an idea of what's behind it. I don't know if I can. So the proof is just, there is a very simple geometric argument for the proof, which is that, so here we want to work in the space of phi of x. So suppose this is I write it in this way. This is the space where you live after mapping your point to phi. So you have some points phi of x in this space. Okay? It's a vector space. And here we start for, remember, we have a training set of n points. So we have x1, x2 until xn. Each of them lives here through phi of x1, phi of x2, phi of xn. So in this space, we can consider a subspace, I write it this way, a finite dimensional subspace that contains 0, which is spanned by the phi of x1, phi of x2, phi of xn. So here, suppose you have somewhere phi of x1. Here you would have phi of x2, etc. Then you have a subspace, which is the set of linear combinations. So I will call that, let's say, S. S is just, in math, it's called S is the span of phi of x1 until phi of xn. So it lives in the, you know, phi of x could be high dimensional, but this is a subspace of dimension at most n. Okay? It exists. Now what we want is in this space, so we want to work in this space, and we want to learn a linear model. So we want to estimate a model, a beta in this space. Okay? Beta could be anywhere. So suppose I consider a vector beta, this vector beta here. Okay, so this vector beta does not need to be in a subspace. It can be anywhere, and the optimization is in all the full space, what is the best beta that minimizes the empirical risk plus lambda times beta square. So this I can write. What I want to do is to minimize in beta, I'll call that the empirical risk of beta plus lambda times the L2 norm of beta. Now the representative theorem just says one thing. It says that the solution of this problem, in fact, has to be in this subspace. And this is what we're going to prove now. So it has to be for a simple reason, which is that if you take a vector beta, any vector beta here, then you can uniquely, you know, decompose it as its projection into the subspace. You do the orthogonal projection, and so there is some, you know, this one I would call beta s, and this one I would call beta orthogonal. So for any vector beta, you can write it. You can write any beta. You can write it as beta s plus beta orthogonal, where beta s is the projection of beta into the subspace, and beta orthogonal is the orthogonal component. Okay? That's always true. Now what I claim is that this guy, beta s, is always at least as good than this guy in terms of optimization problem, and is even strictly better if this guy is non-zero. Why is it the case? Where you see that there are two terms here. There is the empirical risk, and there is the L2 norm. So let's look at the easy part first. In terms of L2 norm, if you compare this beta to this beta s, we want to minimize the L2 norm. So we need to take the smallest of the two. And it's clear that beta s is always smaller than beta. And it's even strictly smaller if you have a non-zero component here, because you do some orthogonal projection. So by Pythagoras theorem, you know that the norm of this vector is always smaller than the norm of this vector. So in terms of, minimizing the L2 norm, it's always better to look at beta S than beta. Now what's interesting is that in terms of empirical risk, by definition, the empirical risk depends on the value of beta on x1, the value of beta on phi of x1, on phi of x2, etc., up to beta times phi of xn. Okay, so these are the predictions of your model beta on the training points, and the loss function that we define, compare your prediction to some y. Okay. Now, because let's look at the first one. When you take beta times phi of x1, you know that beta is equal to beta s plus beta orthogonal. So this I can formally write as beta s times phi of x1 plus beta orthogonal times phi of x1. Okay, this is just the decomposition of beta as a sum of two terms. And it turns out that, remember, that beta orthogonal, by construction, is orthogonal to the subspace S. And S is defined as the set of combination of phi of x1, phi of x2, etc. So in particular, phi of x1 is in the subspace S. And so in particular, beta orthogonal is orthogonal to phi of x1. Okay, so in all cases, this guy here is equal to 0. And so if it's equal to 0, it means that, this equality here tells you that on the point x1, the prediction of beta is the same as the prediction of beta s. So remember, you have beta and beta s, so beta and beta s. And what I just proved is that when you predict the value on the first point, then beta and beta s make the same prediction. In fact, this equality, of course, you can write it for x2 until xn to prove that on all the points, beta and beta s make the same prediction. So they will have, in fact, the same risk. Okay, this implies that the risk of beta is equal to the risk of beta orthogonal. Okay, because the risk only depends on the predictions on the points, on the endpoints. And so now when you combine this observation with the previous observation in terms of norm, so the first observation was the norm of beta is always larger than the norm of beta s. Then when you combine these two results, you see that in terms of objective function, beta s and beta have the same risk, but beta s has always a smaller norm, and it can be strictly smaller if beta is strictly outside of the subspace. So this shows that if beta was outside of the subspace, then I could always find a strictly better point beta s. Okay? And so the corollary is that the solution of this problem is always, if there is a solution, but it has a solution if it's a convex function, for example, then any solution has to be in a subspace. Now, when we say that any solution has to be in a subspace, it means that the solution can always be written as a sum for I equal 1 to n of alpha I phi of xi. Okay, this is the definition of the subspace. The subspace is the set of vectors that are linear combinations of the phi of xi. And so because beta can always be, so I write it beta hat, so the solution of the optimization problem has to be written this way. Then, in particular, when you make a prediction, so the f of x, this is by definition the inner product between beta hat and phi of x. When you replace beta hat by this expansion, then it becomes the sum of alpha I phi of xi times phi of x. Okay, and here we see the kernel because phi of xi times phi of x is exactly the kernel between xi and x. Okay, so this is what was stated in the theorem. I can show it again. The theorem says that any solution of the optimization problem, so in terms of function, can be expanded as a sum of alpha I kernel between xi and x. This is what we get here, and you see that in fact the alpha are exactly the decomposition of beta over the training points phi of xi. So you can either write beta is the sum of alpha I phi of xi, or here we hide the beta and we say directly that the inner product at the optimal itself can be expressed in terms of kernel. And so the second formula here is nothing, but once you know that f can be, so once you know that beta has this formulation, then you can replace beta here by its expression in alpha, and you get the Laue formula here. Okay, there is nothing more here. Okay, so this is the same thing but written in letters, but there is nothing new here. It talks of beta S, beta orthogonal, etc., the same kind of thing. But the idea is really this simple idea of projection. You can show that when you minimize this kind of criterion, even though you may leave, the important thing is that the space could be large. It could be even infinite dimensional. But you can solve this infinite dimensional optimization problem because you know that the solution will always lie in this finite dimensional space, subspace, whose dimension is at most n, the number of points. Okay, so this is the key trick that is valid, again, for any loss function here. Okay, so it's not only for SVM, but all the L2 regularized method that I presented, which you can express this way. You can implement them in the feature space, in the space of phi, because you can express an optimization problem in alpha and express the solution in terms of alpha, where only the kernel plays a role. Question? Yeah.
Is it necessary to use L2 now?
Yeah. I mean, for this result, yes. Now there are papers about what are the minimum conditions to have this representative theorem, and if you make additional assumptions on the space, then you can replace the norm. But for example, some of you may have heard or may be familiar with L1 norms, for example, with the lasso. This is wrong. This theorem does not hold for the L1 norm, for example. Okay. Sorry. And in particular, but I mean, in general, it doesn't hold. In some cases, if you put constraints on, in particular, on the solution, on where is the solution compared with your training points, you may have some partial results. But you see here, the key thing is just this projection and the additivity. I mean, this Pythagoras theorem that is true for L2, but is not true for L1, for example. Another comment is that we will see tomorrow probably that L1 norm is a particular case of L2 norm. I mean, you can express L1 as some variational form over L2 norms, and therefore we will see that lasso can be, I mean, we have similar things for L1 norms or more general group lasso kind of thing. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay. So I spent a fair amount of time on that, but again, this is like the theoretical foundation showing that all that we did with L2 regularized, and I insist, it's a good question, I insist on L2 regularized because this theorem is not true with L1 or LQ or other things, but at least for L2, systematically, any L2 regularized method can be let's call that kernelized. So in some papers, you have proof that we have kernelized a new algorithm. In fact, you can kernelize any algorithm that solves these kind of things. You can generalize a bit this thing, like instead of having some additive thing, you can do exactly the same, exactly the same proof holds when you don't have a sum of two terms, but when you have a global objective function that depends only on the prediction of the n training points, and that is strictly increasing in the norm of beta. So for example, you may know principal component analysis. PCA is not really of this form, but when you write what does PCA, then it satisfies, I mean, you can prove that PCA can be kernelized because it depends on the value of a linear function over the points, and you want to decrease the norm of beta 2. So PCA is principal component analysis is not a particular case of that, but I chose to make a simple form of this theorem. It can be slightly generalized to other methods. But any method can be kernelized, so you can run any method in the feature space with the kernel trick as soon as you do a L2 regularization here. Okay, so let's work out, for example, a simple example that we've seen already. So I talked earlier of ridge regression. Remember that ridge regression minimizes learns a linear function by minimizing the sum of squared error, penalized by the L2 norm of beta. How can we make ridge regression in the space of phi of x? Our theorem says that it's possible, to do ridge regression without computing phi of x. So earlier I presented the solution of, I said that there is an explicit solution, but the explicit solution is in terms of phi of x. Here our theorem says that in theory it should be possible to run ridge regression without computing phi of x. How does that work? Well, if you want to kernelize ridge regression, meaning if you want to express it systematically in a way such that you can run it with the kernel trick, then you can just use the theorem we have seen. So we know by our theorem that any solution of ridge regression in the space of phi of x can be expanded as f of x of the form sum of alpha I k of xi x. We know it exists, and we know we just need to find the alpha, so we need to re-express this optimization problem in terms of alpha. So you see here that f of x, you can replace it by this. So f of xi, you can express it in terms of alpha using this. And the second thing we will see quite often is that we need to express the norm of beta squared in terms of alpha. But remember that because beta, is the sum of alpha I phi of xi, then from this we deduce an important link between beta and alpha, which is that the norm of beta square is the sum of alpha I alpha j phi of xi times phi of xj, so which is exactly the kernel between xi and xj. Okay, this is because the alpha are the expansion, the coefficient that expand beta over the phi of xi. Then the L2 norm of beta, you can take this time itself, you develop it, you get the sum of alpha I alpha j phi of xi times phi of xj. So you can also express the L2 norm of beta as in terms of alpha. So this means that, for instance, for ridge regression, we can just replace that in alpha and replace the L2 norm of beta in alpha to get an optimization problem in alpha. So let's do it. So again, the L2 norm of beta is in vector form is just alpha transpose k alpha. K here now is a matrix, n times n matrix that contains the value of the kernel between all pairs of points. This vector form simply is the sum of alpha I alpha j k of xi xj. So it's alpha transpose k alpha. So this is the L2 norm of beta. And I need, to express, I had to compute f of x1, f of x2, etc. F of x1 by construction, it's the sum of alpha I k of xi xj for f of xj. So in matrix form, when you take your matrix k and multiply it by alpha, you get a vector. And the vector is exactly the values of f at the points x1, x2, xn. Okay, so you can express, with k alpha, you express the values of f on the n points. With alpha k alpha, you express the square norm of beta. And now, you can just plug this into this formula to express what is minimized by alpha. So when you plug it, you obtain this simple thing, which is that the squared error now becomes k alpha. Remember, k alpha is the vector of predictions minus y. So this is the vector of errors times itself. So you get the sum of squared errors. This is the sum of squared error in terms of alpha. And the L2 norm of beta now becomes alpha transpose k alpha. Okay? So now we did the job of kernelization. Now you see that here the data, so the x have disappeared. Now there is only the matrix k, which is the kernel between the pairs of points. So we have expressed our algorithm in terms of kernel. And we need to solve it, meaning we need to express how do we find alpha that minimizes this quadratic form. So it turns out that it's again a quadratic function which is convex. There is a small technicalities, which is that it may not be strictly convex. So we need to be a bit careful when we minimize it. But at the end, skipping some details, to minimize that, more or less, you need to set the gradient to 0 and to see if you can recover alpha. And in fact, you can do it. I skipped some details. But at the end, the solution is as an explicit form. When you set the gradient to 0, you can find that alpha, so the alpha that minimizes the objective function, is simply the kernel matrix where you add lambda n on the diagonal, you invert it, and multiply by y. And this vector alpha here is the vector of coefficients that define the solution with the sum of alpha I, k of x, I, x. Okay, so this is how you would reach regression in the space defined by phi of x without computing phi of x. If you just have access to the kernel, you compute the kernel between all the pairs of points. You compute this, so you need to invert a matrix n by n. Could be costly perhaps, but you need to do that. And once you do that, you just plug back the alpha to this formula to obtain the value of your function in terms of on a new point x. Okay? So this is, similar to what I explained earlier with support vector machines. I explained that you need to solve a problem to find the alpha, and once you have the alpha, you make your prediction this way. Here, the only difference is how you find the alpha, and just like for the direct ridge regression, there was an explicit formula for the beta hat. Here we have an explicit formula for the alpha. And of course, you can check, perhaps it's the next stop, so skipping the details. You can check that I did not do any mistake, meaning that you have two ways to solve ridge regression. Either you find the beta, so beta was this formula in terms of the matrix X, or you find the alpha, which was this this formula here. And in fact, the beta and alpha are related through this thing. You can check it. It's just easy linear algebra. And in terms of computation, what you have to see here is that when you implement ridge regression in the primal, so the standard ridge regression, you need to invert a matrix, which is X transpose X. So the dimension of this matrix is P by P, is the dimension of the space. Okay? When you solve the same problem but in terms of alpha, you also need to invert a matrix, but the dimension is n by n. So it's a bit like SVM. You can choose either to invert a matrix P by P or n by n. And depending on, so P is the dimension of the space, but of the space where you work, so in the space of phi. Okay? So if you have many points in low dimension, then you should just do the standard ridge regression where you compute the covariance matrix. You can invert it easily. But if you work in a feature space that is high dimensional, then it's better to write it in the dual way and to invert the kernel matrix instead of the inner product matrix, because in this case it's an n by n matrix which is independent of the dimension of the space. And so the spirit of kernel methods is to work in very high dimension, perhaps infinite dimensional spaces. So you certainly don't want to compute the covariance, the infinite dimensional covariance matrix, but you can still invert the finite dimensional, n dimensional covariance matrix. So kernel matrix, sorry. Okay? You can check that it's all coherent. There is no difficulty. Okay, so in general, now I worked out the example of SVM. So for SVM, I said, look, the dual, when you look at the dual of SVM, you have inner products, so you can just replace them by kernels. This seems like a lucky guess. Now we have the general theorem that tells us that it's always possible to do what we just did with ridge regression, meaning that when you do some L2 regularized risk minimization, then the solution can be always expressed in terms of kernel, and you can always write some optimization problem in alpha that could be more or less complicated in order to systematically find the alpha. Now the good thing still is that typically the kind of loss functions we consider in this domain are convex loss functions, so that if the loss function is convex, then the optimization problem is a convex optimization problem, meaning it has a unique solution that you can always find more or less easily, but in principle, you can always write some optimization algorithm to find it. And here, the loss function in the primal is the same as in the dual. Here you again have your loss function. So this whole thing in terms of alpha is always also a convex optimization problem. Okay, so it was true for SVM, it was true for a ridge regression, but whatever the loss function, you can do the logistic problem. If you want to implement logistic regression in the feature space, then you need to solve this problem in alpha, where the loss function is the logistic loss. But this becomes a convex problem in alpha. You can still compute the gradient, the Hessian, and you can still run a Newton step, but not in the original space, now in the feature space induced by any kernel. Yeah?
Are there some requirements for the loss function? So that 0, 1 loss is discontinuous. Is that pretty hard to?
Yeah, so typically, I said we love convex loss functions because we can solve them. If you take the zero and loss function, then you cannot solve that anymore. It becomes a combinatorial problem, so it's in most cases NP hard to solve. Any other question? Yeah.
Could you explain again why the representative theorem doesn't work for the L1 norm? Because the function is the same, and then the second term, if you change that to L1 norm, it still holds.
No, it doesn't hold anymore. Well, I mean, if you do the orthogonal projection, yeah, then the L1 norm of the orthogonal projection could be larger than the L1 norm of beta.
I didn't see it from this theorem.
I mean, think of the, I don't know in 2D if it's, perhaps you need to move to 3D, but so for example, in I keep the question for the end, okay? But so yeah, it's related to this orthogonal projection on this subspace. Any other easy question?
I have another silly question. So,
Yeah.
Because now when we are talking about kernels, then we sometimes interpret it as similarity matrix.
Yeah.
So that actually the kernel values actually from here is like it's an inner product. Each element of the kernel is like inner product of the phi function, right?
Yeah.
So but now we didn't really normalize the inner product. As we know, the inner product is actually a times b, the absolute value of a times absolute value of b, and then the cosine of the angle between.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the cosine between is actually a many of the similarities, but then there is like the two terms before.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So we didn't normalize that.
No, we did not normalize. So I will talk now more about kernels, and we will see that there are more interesting kernels, in particular the Gaussian kernel, etc., that are normalized, meaning that all the points have norm equal to 1, and then only the cosine, I mean the angle between vectors becomes important. Okay, but still, if you run a linear model, then you should not normalize. I mean, learning a linear model is formally equivalent to a kernel, which is the inner product, which takes into account the norm of the vectors and the cosine. And because it's the true inner product, it exactly corresponds to learning a linear model in the input space. So you don't always need to normalize a kernel.
Okay, so this means that the kernel is not necessarily equivalent to similarity.
I think it depends. There is mathematically a kernel is an inner product. Then the notion of similarity, I'm not sure there is any clear mathematical definition. We will see that in many cases, and very quickly, we will see that you can interpret it as similarity, in particular when you think of the functions f, which are defined, and how the smoothness of f depends on the similarity, the kernel between the points. But certainly, it's not a similarity, and in particular, yeah, I mean, if you just say the inner product, it could be large or small depending on the norm of the vector, or not depending on their distance, for example. So it's a bit more complicated. At least one thing I could add to the discussion is that if you give me an inner product, I can always deduce a distance. If you give me points and you give me all the pairwise inner product, then I can compute the Euclidean distance between all pairs of points. So to any kernel, at least, I can associate something else, which is the distance, or the square distance between the points, which is a function of the kernel. And here I can really say that a kernel defines a metric, so a geometric distance between the points, that is the Euclidean distance after the embedding. But the kernel itself has no reason to have a direct interpretation in terms of similarity. Okay? So to move forward, I will skip the case of SVM. We talked enough about SVM, but I just want to point out that if you're interested to go into the details of this course, etc., for the SVM, I mean, I used two strategies. For the SVM, I said, look, we computed the dual with the linear SVM, and we saw that dual can be expressed only in terms of inner product, so I can replace the inner product with the kernel. Then I've kernelized it. Now, for the SVM, you could also use the representative theorem and say that because SVM minimizes the average hinge loss plus L2 regularization, I can apply the representative theorem and show that the solution can be expressed as a sum of alpha I k of xi x, and that formally the alpha can be found by solving some optimization problem where I plug the alpha into the hinge loss. Okay, so I could get a third formulation of SVM, which is not the dual one, which is just replacing the direct one, the beta by the alpha using this. So this is what's written here. You know, this big thing is just when I replace the beta in terms of alpha by applying the representative theorem. And earlier I said that you can also write a dual problem where you also have alpha. So there could be some confusion about are they the same alphas or are they different? I mean, in both cases we solve an n-dimensional problem, but here you have the hinge loss, here is the dual problem, and in fact you can check that these two problems in alpha are also dual to each other according to Lagrange duality. So, you know, it's possible. So in fact you have three formulations of SVM. You have the direct formulation in terms of beta, so you could even solve it, you know, find beta by trying to minimize the average hinge loss in terms of beta. Then a second formulation, I will call it primal, but primal in terms of alpha, is just when you replace the beta by alpha. So you're still in the primal space with the hinge loss, but you have changed the variable from beta to alpha. And you also have a dual formulation, which is always in terms of alpha, okay, which is a different optimization problem, but at the end, they all lead to the same solution. Okay, so now I will talk more about the kernels and, you know, related a bit to the question on similarity, etc. Once, you know, for the moment I've said, well, we can work in linear spaces or we can work in any space defined by a mapping phi. So this raises the question of, well, can we play with the mapping phi and therefore get a series of function k that could be kernels? There was a question of, you know, why do we want, so what is specific about kernels? I said a kernel is a function that is an inner product. So now we'll discuss a bit more. What is the set of functions that you can use and how can you, you know, use a specific kernel or perhaps invent a new kernel corresponding to some specific mapping phi so that you can run your method in a space that fits well your problem or your data. Okay, so for this, let's start with some, you know, what's the mathematical foundations behind all that, and we will see that there will be some technicalities, but I will probably skip most of the two technical parts. But you know, in short, there is a nice complete mathematical theory underlying the notion of kernels and what are the possible kernels, and how do you reinterpret all the methods in terms of functional spaces, etc. I will not go to all details, I have no time, but if you're interested, there are books about that. It's a complete story that you can read. Okay, so let's start with at least a few important results. So remember, I said that, well, if you give me two vectors, x and x prime, so two finite dimensional vectors, you compute their inner product, you add one, you take it to the power 5, and the number you obtain, I claim, is a kernel, so it's some inner product in some space. So, you know, as was said earlier, I could start directly with this and tell you, well, this is a kernel. And what I mean by this is a kernel means that I know that this number here that you compute can be expressed as some inner product between phi of x and phi of x prime for some phi. There are some other functions. For example, if you do this minus 1, okay, then I can show that if you take the inner product minus 1 to the power d, this is not a kernel, meaning that you will not be able to express it as some inner product in some space. Okay? This may not be obvious, and this may raise the question, so how do you know which functions are inner products? How do you know which functions are kernels? And can we characterize them? Can we say more about what's the difference between different kernels? Which ones could be used for which applications, etc. So let's study that a bit in detail. And so again, recall, so what I call a kernel, to be more formal, is any function k living in a space X. So capital X is the space of input data. I said this could be some vectors, but this could be strings, this could be images, this could be whatever. And I would say that a function k of xx prime is a kernel for me in this course. If and only if you can express it as some inner product. So I'm sorry, I changed a bit notations here. Instead of using the transpose sign, because there will be different inner products, I use the bracket sign, but it's really the same. Here I put phi of x times phi of x prime in bracket with h here. It just means that I take the inner product in the space between phi of x and phi of x prime in the vector space H. Okay? And so for me, a function k is a kernel if and only if there exists a space H with some inner product, and there exists a mapping phi from X to H such that my kernel can be written as some inner product. This is what I call a kernel. And we saw a few examples of them. The inner product is a kernel. The inner product to some power is a kernel. Now the question is, if you give me a new function k, can you systematically say if it's a kernel or not, or can you characterize a set of kernels? Perhaps I should say at this moment that my talk is not about Bayesian methods, but there is also a big world of Bayesian methods, and in particular you may have heard of Gaussian processes. In fact, all that I said, so in particular the notion of kernel is exactly the same as the notion of covariance in Gaussian processes. Okay, so if you're afraid of kernels and SVM, but you're good in Gaussian processes, just replace the word kernel by covariance, and then this thing becomes simply, if you give me a function of x and x prime, is it a valid covariance? Okay, we will see. It's not obvious now, but I will show now that it's really equivalent. They are based on the same thing. So even if you are Bayesian, you may find this thing, some of the things I will mention interesting because they can be used directly in Gaussian processes, for example. Okay, perhaps again I will skip the technical details, but just one word here. I didn't use any word to characterize heat, the space here. In fact, in this definition, I say we need to have a space H. Okay, and this has to be a space of vectors with some inner product. So in mathematics, the kind of space that we will look at are called the Hilbert spaces. So H is a Hilbert space, therefore we use the word H. But Hilbert space for us is just a space of vectors with some inner product. We use the word Hilbert space instead of Euclidean space simply because by convention Euclidean is restricted to the space with finite dimension, and Hilbert includes finite dimensions and infinite dimensions. So here we will need infinite dimensions. Therefore we use the word Hilbert, but I could almost just say that this is a vector space with some inner product. It has to be complete, but we will not go to these technicalities here. Okay, so in case you need to know what a Hilbert space is, it's here. Now, the first important result we will show is that we can characterize the functions which are a kernel. Okay, and in fact, perhaps I can just show this result and go back to the definition. We can prove, and I will quickly prove it, it was proved 60 years ago, that a function k is a kernel. So if you give me a function k of xx prime, I can say whether or not it's a valid kernel, so whether or not it's an inner product. And it's an inner product, it's a kernel, if and only if it is a function that is called positive definite. So what is a positive definite function? This is the definition. So a function k is positive definite if and only if it satisfies two conditions. So there is an easy condition, which is that it has to be symmetric, meaning that if you give me k, you need to have k of xx prime invariant by inversion of xx prime. So xx prime equals to x prime x. And this is quite natural because if it's an inner product between phi of x and phi of x prime, it has to be invariant. The inner product is invariant by swapping, so the kernel has to be invariant. So that's easy. The second part is less trivial, but it's not too difficult either. It just says that if you give me any set of data, so x1, x2, xn, and if you compute, so given this data, you have given me a kernel function k, so you can compute a matrix, a square matrix, with all values of the kernels between the n by n points. So it's called the Gram matrix that we've seen earlier. If you compute this matrix has to be symmetric, because k is symmetric, and it has to be positive semi-definite. meaning that it's a symmetric matrix, so it has eigenvalues, which could be positive or negative. And the constraint we want is that whatever the set of points you get, when you compute the matrix, it should never have any negative eigenvalues. And if a function k has this property, so it's equivalent to this fact here that if you give me any set of n points and any set of n real scalars, a1, a2, and n, then the sum of ai, aj, k of xi, aj has to be non-negative. Okay? So this is the property of a function k. Some function k have these properties, some don't have this property. And the theorem here tells us that a function k has this property if and only if it is a valid kernel. So perhaps it's not very helpful because if you give me a function k, to know whether or not it's a kernel, I need to know whether or not it's positive definite, and this could be difficult to show, but at least it's a generic and true property that a function is a kernel if and only if it is positive definite. Okay? And so perhaps for those of you who do Gaussian processes, etc., this is something familiar to you. You may know that a function k is a valid covariance if and only if it's positive definite. So for me, it's if and only if it's a kernel. It's really the same. Okay. How do we prove that? So there is an easy thing to prove and a difficult one to prove. So the easy part is if you start with a kernel, then obviously it has to be positive definite according to my definition. Why is it so? Well, so if you start from a function k, which you know is a kernel. So if you know it's a kernel, it means that you know that k of x prime is some inner product, phi of x times phi of x prime. This is always true. Now, I claim that any such function is positive definite according to my definition of positive definiteness. Remember, there are two things. One is it has to be symmetric, and the second is this positive semi-definite matrix story. So the symmetry is obvious here because if k of x prime is phi of x times phi of x prime, because the inner product in the space H itself is symmetric, you can write phi of x times phi of x prime as phi of x prime times phi of x by symmetry of the inner product. And this is exactly the kernel between x prime and x. So the kernel, any kernel has to be symmetric because it's an inner product. The second part is not very complicated either because remember the second part is something like you give me any set of n data, so x1, x2, xn, and you give me any set of numbers a1, a2, an. You want to compute the sum in I and j of ai times aj times the kernel between xi and xj. Okay? So if you know that the kernel is some inner product, you can replace the kernel by the inner product. And because an inner product is bilinear, meaning it's linear in the first and in the second argument, you can factorize this double sum as a single sum. So here I directly write in terms of norm. This thing is simply the square norm in the vector space H of the vector sum of alpha I phi of xi. Okay, because if you take the square norm, the definition of the square norm is the inner product between this vector and itself. And so when you expand, you have a sum of alpha of ai phi of xi times itself. You can expand it and recover exactly this thing. And so a square norm is always non-negative. Okay? So you get that this ugly quadratic form is always non-negative, and this is precisely the condition that a positive definite function has to meet. Okay? So this shows that if you start from a kernel, meaning that if you start from some inner product in some space, then it is positive definite. And in particular, in terms of matrix, it means that if you give me a valid kernel, like the polynomial kernel, I said that you give me any set of points, you compute the Gram matrix, or the matrix, the n by n matrix of kernels between all pairs of points, you know that this matrix will never have any negative eigenvalue. It's mathematically impossible because the kernel is a valid kernel. And this is true for any kernel which is an inner product. Okay, so that's the easy thing to show that if you are a kernel, you are positive definite. Now, the converse is a bit more tricky. And in fact, people have tried to prove that for quite some time before. So it was in a century ago. People were looking at this problem. And so the question is, if you give me a positive definite function, is it a kernel? Meaning, can you write it as some inner product in some space? that would then justify that you could use it in SVM, for example. So when you work in a finite space, it's quite easy to do. I will not go through the details, you can read it, but basically, if your space of data is not vectors, but it's just a set of 100 objects, then a kernel over this space is just a function that takes 2 objects and output a number. You can create a big matrix of all the kernel values. And if you assume that your kernel is positively definite, then you can use standard linear algebra to show that this matrix can be diagonalized, etc., and that you can write the kernel as some inner product with well-chosen phi. Okay, so when the space X is finite, this is easy folklore in linear algebra to show that positively definite means that you can, in fact, you have a kernel and you can express a matrix K as X times X transpose. This is quite easy. Now, in fact, the result is true without any constraint on the space X. And when I say it was not easy, it means that, Mercer proved the partial result in 1909. Then it took more than 40 years for the final result to be proved. So just again, I will not go to too much details, but for your information, there is a subclass of kernels which are called the Mercer kernels, which is a word you may have seen or you may encounter in the world of positively definite kernel. So Mercer kernels is a subclass of kernels. These are function K, which are kernels, but with 2 conditions. The first condition is that the space X is what's called compact. So in particular, it's not R. It has to be like bounded, this kind of thing. And the second, more importantly, is that when the space is compact, you consider just continuous functions. Okay? If you consider continuous functions over a compact space, which are positively definite, then these are called Mercer kernels. And in a sense, this proof here can be extended to this case because continuous functions over compact spaces have properties similar to matrices over finite spaces. Like if you go to the limit, this theorem, when X is infinite, then you need to go to some limits, okay? And the limit is valid when the space is compact and the function is continuous. So you can prove the same thing to show that a Mercer kernel is positively definite if and only if it's an inner product, okay? But in the general case, it's more complicated. So if you make no assumption on X and on K, if you just say I have any space X and I have a function K, how can I prove that if it's positively definite, then it's an inner product? And it was shown later by Aaron Jan in particular. And for that, he had to develop a new tool, a new mathematical object called the RKHS, which I will not go through in detail, but in a sense, which is a new space, a new Hilbert space H, that allows you to express each kernel as an inner product. So let me just say one word about RKHS because I think tomorrow I would like to spend more time in the following section. So RKHS in itself is a very fascinating and important topic. You could study it if you're interested to hear about that. But in short, it's a space. It's a space of functions that over the set X that allow to express any kernel as some inner product. And perhaps I will. So as I said, there are many slides, and I will skip most of them. This is the part where, if you're interested, you can look in more detail and see how we construct the RKHS, etc. But the important thing is that. So it's a bit cryptic here, but remember that what we want to show is that if you give me a function K which is positively definite, I want to show that you can write it as some inner product. So if you look at the slides, you will see that if your function is positively definite, then it always has something that's called the RKHS, meaning that there always exists a space of functions associated to the kernel that has some properties, which I skip, but it exists. And in particular, this space, so RK means it's a reproducing kernel. And once you have a reproducing kernel, and you see there is quite some math involved here, then you can show that if you start from a positively definite kernel, then you can write it as some inner product. Probably the proof is, the proof is just here. It's just that if you have a positively definite kernel and you believe the slides, then associated to it, there is a space of functions called RKHS, which itself is a is a Hilbert space. So it's a space with an inner product. And there is a mapping phi that maps any point x to a point of the RKHS. Okay? And it turns out that if you take this mapping phi, then you can express your kernel, k of x prime, as the inner product between phi of x and phi of x prime in the RKHS. So the short take-home message is that there is this ugly space here that I did not present, but I tell you it exists, which exists for any positive definite kernel. And if it exists, then you can write any positive definite kernel as some inner product in the RKHS here. So this is what's needed to prove that we can characterize all kernels as the space of functions which are positive definite. And we will use that tomorrow in order to construct and investigate in more details some kernels. Okay? Okay. So I will stop here for today. I'm sorry I had to skip, I had to make choices and I had to skip a big part of it. I suppose not everybody is interested in all details of RKHS, but if you are, don't hesitate to look at the slides here, and there are many books and textbooks about that explain a bit the mathematical foundations of these things, that for us at least, so RKHS allow us to prove this theorem, and we will see that they're also useful to reinterpret all the kernel methods, so all these algorithms, in terms of optimization over functional spaces. It may be a bit complicated here, but we will say a few words about that tomorrow.